My wife secretly sold my grandmother's coin collection to pay off her brother's debts. I grew up under the watchful, loving gaze of my grandmother. For as long as I could remember, she had been the cornerstone of our family, a living library of our history, keeper of our traditions, and the glue that held everything together. As a child, I would sit beside her as she told stories about her youth, her struggles, and the values that defined her life. She believed in preserving the past, not for the sake of nostalgia, but because she thought it was the map that guided our future. Her most prized possession was her coin collection. Over the span of 50 years, she had painstakingly gathered coins from every corner of the globe. Each coin came with a story. A rare penny she found during a tough winter when money was tight, a silver dollar gifted by her late husband on their anniversary, or a foreign coin brought back by a distant cousin who had traveled the world. For her, it wasn't just about the coin's monetary value. It was about the memories they carried, the lessons they taught. When she passed, it hit me harder than I expected. She had been my rock through every storm, and suddenly she was gone. In her will, she left me her cherished coin collection, along with a handwritten note. She asked me to treasure it, as she had, and to one day pass it down to my children. The note ended with her signature phrase, "Our legacy is what we choose to protect." The collection was later appraised at $55,000. I was stunned by its financial worth, but to me, it was priceless for other reasons. Life moved quickly after her death. My wife, Julia, and I decided to buy a new house, a step forward for our growing family. It was exciting but chaotic, packing, planning, juggling work and parenting. All of it piled on at once. In the whirlwind of it all, I entrusted Julia with the responsibility of safeguarding the collection. I thought it was the right choice. After all, she knew how much it meant to me. I had shared countless stories about my grandmother, about the lessons those coins symbolized, and about the promise I had made to preserve them. A few weeks after settling into the new house, I finally felt like life was starting to regain its balance. It was a quiet Saturday when I found myself thinking about my grandmother. Her voice echoed in my mind, her words a gentle reminder of the values she had passed on. That's when it hit me. I hadn't checked on the coins since the move. I walked into the study, expecting to find the collection where I had left it before the move. It wasn't there. Frowning, I searched the shelves and the desk drawers, even checking the boxes we hadn't yet unpacked. Nothing. My pulse quickened as I realized I didn't know where it was. Julia was in the kitchen when I asked her about it. I didn't sense anything unusual at first, but when I mentioned the coins, she hesitated. Her answer wasn't immediate. Instead, she busied herself with tidying up, her movements sharp and deliberate. When she finally responded, her tone was too casual, almost dismissive. She said she couldn't remember where she had placed them, but assured me they were somewhere safe. The words didn't sit right with me. Julia had always been organized to a fault. She could tell you exactly where every item in the house was stored. Yet, somehow, she didn't remember where she had put something so important. I pressed her gently, trying to mask the rising unease in my voice. Her response was short, her tone clipped, and she quickly changed the subject. The pit in my stomach deepened. Julia had never acted like this before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I left the kitchen, questions swirled in my mind, each one darker than the last. Why was she being evasive? Could it be a simple misunderstanding, or was there something she wasn't telling me? That night, I lay awake, my thoughts racing. The collection was more than just a box of coins. It was a piece of my grandmother, a promise I had made to her, and a connection to my family's past. Losing it wasn't an option, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that Julia's behavior held answers I wasn't ready to face. I couldn't let the unease linger any longer. The next morning, I pressed Julia for a straight answer about the coins. Her avoidance the day before had planted too many doubts, and I needed clarity. I told her I wasn't angry, that I just needed to know they were safe. But instead of reassuring me, she froze. It was subtle, but I noticed how her eyes darted away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as though steadying herself. Her silence grew heavier with every second, and my patience wore thin. Finally, she took a deep breath and blurted out the truth. The coins were gone. My chest tightened as I struggled to comprehend what she had just said. Gone? I asked her to explain, and her words came in halting fragments, each one hitting me like a punch. She had sold them. It felt like the ground beneath me shifted. I couldn't understand how she could have done this, especially knowing what the collection meant to me. Her voice cracked as she continued, telling me about her brother Mark. He had gotten himself into trouble, serious trouble, after a failed cryptocurrency investment. He'd borrowed money to chase what he thought would be a life-changing opportunity, only to see it evaporate. When the creditors came calling, Mark had nowhere to turn, and Julia said he'd reached a breaking point, even threatening to harm himself. She told me she'd acted out of desperation. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her brother, so she sold the collection to pay off his debts. Her reasoning was simple, almost heartbreakingly so. Saving a life mattered more than preserving some old coins. Her words felt like shards of glass, cutting into me with every syllable. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. Her words about protecting our legacy, about honoring our family's past. And now it was gone. The years of effort, the stories tied to each coin, the promise I had made, all of it wiped out in a single, unilateral decision. Anger surged through me, raw and unfiltered. I demanded to know why she hadn't come to me first. We could have found another solution together. She defended herself, saying there wasn't time, that Mark's situation was too urgent. Her voice rose, and I could see the guilt etched into her face, but it only fueled my frustration. To her, the coins were just objects, replaceable. To me, they were irreplaceable pieces of my family's soul. As I paced the room, trying to make sense of it all, Julia shifted her tone. She said she had done what she thought was right, and she didn't regret saving her brother. Her words felt like a slap. She accused me of valuing the collection more than a human life. The accusation stung, but it didn't feel fair. It wasn't just about the coins. It was about the trust she had broken, the decisions she had made without me. It was about the promise I had made to my grandmother, a promise that was now shattered. The argument escalated. Every word between us was a battle, sharp and cutting. I told her she had betrayed not just me, but the very values we'd built our marriage on. She countered that I was being selfish, clinging to the past while ignoring the present crisis. Neither of us was willing to back down, and the rift between us grew wider with every exchange. By the time the shouting stopped, we were left standing in silence, the weight of what had happened hanging over us like a storm cloud. Julia looked at me with a mix of defiance and remorse, and I knew this was far from over. I couldn't just let it go, couldn't simply forgive and forget. The coins were gone, but the betrayal, the cracks it had created in our relationship, was something I wasn't sure we could ever repair. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I kept hearing my grandmother's words. Our legacy is what we choose to protect. I had failed her. Julia had failed me. And now, I had to figure out how to move forward in a marriage that suddenly felt like it was built on quicksand. The days that followed Julia's confession were a blur of silence and simmering tension. I couldn't bring myself to look at her without feeling the weight of what had been lost. The betrayal wasn't just about the coins. It was about what they symbolized, the trust and understanding I had thought existed between us. Now, that foundation felt irreparably cracked. As I tried to make sense of it all, memories of Mark began to surface. Julia's brother had always been a source of quiet frustration for me. He had a long history of poor decisions, from reckless spending sprees to failed business ventures. Time and time again, he would land himself in trouble and turn to Julia for help. She always obliged, often without consulting me. I'd let it go before, chalking it up to sibling loyalty, but this time was different. This time, it wasn't just a loan or a favor. It was a sacrifice that cut to the core of my identity. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. Julia had always prioritized Mark, even when it came at a cost to our marriage. I'd seen the warning signs, but I'd ignored them, convincing myself that her loyalty to her family was just part of who she was. Now, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd been fooling myself all along. Word of the situation began to spread among our friends and family. Julia had confided in a few close friends, seeking their understanding, and before long, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some people took her side, arguing that family comes first, no matter what. They pointed out that Mark's life had been at stake and that Julia had done what she thought was necessary to save him. Others were firmly in my corner, emphasizing the gravity of her betrayal and the fact that she had made such a monumental decision without consulting me. The divide only added fuel to the fire, making it even harder to see a path forward. The tension in the house became unbearable. Conversations were clipped, and the few moments of civility between us felt forced. Even the kids picked up on it, their usual chatter replaced by cautious glances and quiet whispers. I knew something had to give. After yet another night of restless sleep, I suggested we take some time apart. Julia agreed, though the resignation in her voice stung. It wasn't what either of us wanted, but it seemed like the only way to stop the downward spiral. I packed a few bags and took the kids to my parents' house. They were thrilled to have us there, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Being back in my childhood home brought a strange mix of comfort and pain. It was a reminder of simpler times, of the values my grandmother had instilled in me, values I now felt I had failed to uphold. In the quiet moments after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself replaying everything in my mind. Julia's tearful explanation, Mark's reckless behavior, the voices of friends and family weighing in on the situation. It all blended into a cacophony of doubt and confusion. I knew I had to make a choice. Forgiveness seemed impossible, but so did the thought of walking away from the life we'd built together. The idea of starting over, of breaking up our family, was a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. At the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that staying would mean compromising a part of myself. Julia's actions had gone against everything I believed in, everything I had promised my grandmother I would protect. If I forgave her, would it mean accepting that my values didn't matter? Would it set a precedent that her choices, no matter how hurtful, would always come first? These thoughts consumed me as the days turned into weeks. Julia and I kept in touch for the sake of the kids, but our conversations were strained and devoid of warmth. I could hear the regret in her voice, but it wasn't enough to bridge the growing chasm between us. Each interaction felt like walking a tightrope, one misstep away from total collapse. By the end of that week, I still didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the life we'd once shared felt like a distant memory, and the road ahead seemed uncertain at best. The only thing I could do was take it one day at a time, hoping that clarity would come before it was too late. The weeks spent apart from Julia were filled with reflection and uncertainty. Each day felt like an uphill battle, but the questions swirling in my mind wouldn't let me rest. I needed answers, real answers, not just to understand what had happened, but to figure out how or if we could move forward. That's when I decided to speak to Mark directly. Meeting Mark wasn't easy. He and I had never been particularly close. Our interactions were polite but distant, shaped more by obligation than genuine connection. As I sat across from him at the coffee shop, I could see the weight of his own guilt etched across his face. He looked uncomfortable, like a man bracing for impact. I wasted no time, diving straight into the heart of the matter. I needed to hear his side of the story. Mark's response caught me off guard. He admitted that while he had been in a dire situation, he had never asked Julia to sell the coin collection. He had confided in her about his financial troubles, but the decision to sell the coins was entirely hers. She had acted out of love and desperation, wanting to shield him from harm. He spoke with remorse, expressing regret for becoming the catalyst of such a devastating conflict between us. He assured me he never intended for things to spiral this far and apologized for the pain it had caused. Hearing this didn't make things easier. If anything, it complicated my feelings further. On one hand, Mark's honesty shed light on Julia's intentions. She hadn't acted under pressure from him, but had instead made the choice herself, driven by her fear of losing her brother. On the other hand, it only reinforced the idea that she had betrayed me, not out of malice, but because she had prioritized someone else over our shared values and trust. When I returned home later that evening, I knew it was time to confront Julia. Avoiding the conversation wouldn't change anything, and the distance between us had already grown too vast. Sitting across from her in the living room, I laid out everything I had learned from Mark. Her expression shifted from surprise to sadness as I recounted his version of events. She didn't try to deny it or deflect responsibility. Instead, she took a deep breath and admitted that she had made a mistake. Julia explained how helpless she had felt when Mark confided in her. Seeing him on the brink had shaken her, and she had acted impulsively, convinced that saving him was the right thing to do. She hadn't thought about the long-term consequences, only the immediate crisis. Her voice wavered as she apologized, acknowledging the pain her actions had caused me. She said she hadn't realized how deeply the collection meant to me beyond its financial value. To her, it had been a solution to an urgent problem, but now she saw it was so much more than that. Despite her apology, the wound was still fresh. I told her how betrayed I had felt, how her decision had shaken the foundation of trust between us. She listened, tears welling in her eyes, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of sincerity that made me believe she truly understood the gravity of what she had done. But understanding didn't erase the hurt. Julia's next word surprised me. She said she wanted to make things right. While she couldn't undo the sale, she had been in contact with the buyer and was willing to do whatever it took to recover the collection or, at the very least, its value. She knew it wouldn't fix everything, but it was her way of showing that she was willing to fight for us, to restore even a fraction of what had been lost. Her offer was a step in the right direction, but it didn't change the fact that our relationship had been fundamentally altered. The trust that had been broken wouldn't be easy to rebuild. As I sat there, listening to her plea, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something that would come overnight. It would take time, effort, and a willingness from both of us to face the damage head-on. That night, we agreed to take things one step at a time. Julia would work on recovering the collection, and I would focus on healing the parts of me that had been so deeply hurt. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Forgiveness wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only path forward. After weeks of reflection and strained conversations, I told Julia I was willing to try. However, I made it clear that things couldn't simply return to the way they were. Our relationship needed to change. We needed to rebuild trust and learn how to make decisions together. Julia agreed without hesitation, her sincerity evident in the way she approached our discussion. She knew her actions had hurt me deeply, and she was ready to face the consequences. One of the conditions I set was that Julia would no longer take responsibility for Mark's mistakes. I told her it was time for her brother to stand on his own feet and face the outcomes of his choices. Julia hesitated but ultimately agreed. She admitted that enabling him hadn't helped him in the long run, and that it was time for tough love. True to her word, Julia began working on recovering the coin collection. She tracked down the buyer, a private collector who had purchased it shortly after the sale. Negotiating with him wasn't easy. The collector had no intention of letting the coins go for less than a significant profit, knowing full well their sentimental and financial value. Julia didn't back down, even when it became clear that buying back the collection would stretch us financially. She saw it as a necessary step toward making amends. After weeks of back and forth, Julia managed to convince the collector to sell the coins back. The price was steep, totaling $85,000, far more than what she had sold them for. To make it happen, Julia sold her nearly new car and started biking to work every day, no matter the weather. She also parted with some of her cherished jewelry, pieces she had always treasured. Watching her go through the process, I saw a side of her I hadn't fully appreciated before. She wasn't just apologizing with words. She was showing me through her actions that she was committed to rebuilding what we had lost. When the coins were finally back in my hands, I felt a wave of relief and gratitude. Holding them again was like reconnecting with a piece of my grandmother, a piece of myself. But this time, they came with an even deeper lesson. The collection wasn't just a symbol of legacy anymore. It was a testament to the resilience of our marriage and the importance of fighting for what truly matters. I decided to store the coins in a secure safe, ensuring they would be protected no matter what. As I locked them away, I promised myself that one day, I would sit down with my children and share the story of my grandmother, her values, and the journey the coins had taken. They needed to understand that these weren't just objects, but a part of our family's history and heart. Julia and I began to rebuild our lives together. It wasn't an overnight fix, but each day brought small victories. We started going to couples therapy, learning how to communicate better and navigate disagreements in a healthier way. Trust was something we had to earn back, bit by bit, but the effort was mutual. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were truly partners. Mark, too, began to change. Without Julia there to bail him out, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. He found a job, started paying off his debts, and even reached out to me to apologize again for the role he had played in the chaos. It wasn't an easy road for him, but I respected the effort he was making to turn things around. Looking back, I realized that this ordeal had taught me more than I ever expected. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. Our legacy is what we choose to protect. It wasn't just about the coins. It was about the values they represented, trust, love, and the strength to overcome challenges together. Julia and I had been tested, but we had emerged on the other side stronger and more united. As I sat with my children one evening, recounting stories of my grandmother and her coin collection, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The coins were safe, but more importantly, the lessons they carried were alive and well. Our family's legacy wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about building a future rooted in trust and understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about what lay ahead.
Bye-bye.